Stop thinking about filing of a patent as a protection for a past event. What are the revenue drivers that are going to happen in the future and the potential applications for this technology?
On this week's episode, we welcome Mike McLean from Innovation Asset Collective to discuss all things intellectual property and how founders can be more prepared for IP-related challenges when entering global markets. Mike shares how startups can leverage IP for significant value creation and create a process of building a defensive patent portfolio to protect themselves against larger companies. We dig into the role that government plays in helping Canadian tech companies secure and commercialize their intellectual property, as well as some of the common IP mistakes startups make when ignoring IP. Lastly, we discuss how IP insurance works and why it's crucial for companies facing potential legal challenges from larger incumbents in our increasingly litigious world. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Mike McLean. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Mike.
Really glad to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
You know, Mike, your journey as an entrepreneur and operator around the intellectual property area is something that I think our listeners will get a lot of value out of. So maybe you can give our listeners a brief background on where you got started and how you ended up in your current role today.
Sure, Matt. I started my career in tech in the mid-90s in Ottawa. Joined a company which at the time was called Semiconductor Insights, eventually changed its name to Tech Insights. And that company was, at the time, really a lab services firm doing reverse engineering of semiconductors and consumer electronics. And joined in an engineering role, eventually moved more into the business side. But the use case for that lab work was really sold into two markets. The first market was for benchmarking and competitive intelligence for companies looking to understand what was going on in the markets. And the second use case was intellectual property. We were basically the CSI of the patent world. If you wanted to gather evidence of infringement to take into a lawsuit or take into a licensing negotiation, you hired our firm and had us perform investigations of competitors' products to aid in that process. Over time, I eventually ran the IP business unit. So for close to 15 years, I led that business unit, which generated over 2/3 of the revenue for the company for a substantial portion of that time, and really worked to engage and grow that business. And we were working with some of the largest technology companies around the world, the Nokias, the Intels, the Samsungs, the Texas Instruments of the world that had very large market shares in key technology spaces, dominant patent positions, and were not shy in using those patent holdings to really drive revenue into their businesses, but also to defend market share and aggressively build out the opportunities that their businesses were provided with. So learned a lot about the use of intellectual property and how large companies think about intellectual property, while at the same time being part of an SME here in Canada that was building and growing a business and understanding it from the other side of the equation. What are the technologies we needed to innovate in order to be successful and compete in our market space? How did we create a suite of patents and trade secrets around those technologies so that we had differentiated capabilities in the marketplace? And what really drove ultimate value with that business was how did we start to capture the analysis we're doing into a resellable database and build business models and protection around that? And when we really got a hold of that, that's when that business really took off, and it eventually exited in a 9-figure deal several years ago. So really big success in the Canadian space, and intellectual property played a key role in that endeavor.
You know, Mike, you have lived and breathed the intellectual property arena for a very long time. And I think when we talk about intellectual property from a startup perspective, it's usually viewed as a value protection tool or a value creation tool. And a lot of the time, startups are so focused on trying to get their businesses to actually sell a product or service that they don't really spend a lot of cycles or even capital and resources, which are often limited, especially in today's day, to build that value protection because they still haven't figured out the value creation side of it. So how have you thought about building out and advising companies around their IP strategy? Because I know that a lot of people are like, well, maybe I'll just run into a patent troll and they're going to, litigate their way to success and basically stop my business from ever getting off the ground and selling anything.
We really try and link those two pieces together. What is the business opportunity and what is the intellectual property really needed to sustain that business opportunity over time? So when we talk to SMEs, whether they're our members or just other companies in the Canadian ecosystem, we're really looking to change the way those entrepreneurs think about intellectual property and use intellectual property within their business. Far too often you'll hear companies talk about the fact they've filed a provisional patent around their core innovation. They feel they've kind of started that process and that's sufficient. Or they'll talk about treating everything as a trade secret and that the NDA everybody they're talking to, and again, they feel that that's sufficient at this point in time. But that really doesn't think about how are they competing and winning business? What are the features of their technology or features of their product that are actually going to drive revenue into the business? How are they building an ownership position around those features, around the technology that enables those features, so that they can sustain that differentiation over time, so they can demand premium pricing, so that they can keep competitors at bay as they move forward and really use those tools as a revenue driver within the business. Now, to do that, you've got to know your market space well. You've got to understand how are the other companies competing? What are you going to take to market that's going to really win a sale? And what intellectual property positions do other organizations or companies hold that could impact your approach? By considering those three pieces, you can both understand what intellectual property you need to build and develop over time, as well what risks do you face and what risk mitigation mechanisms do you need to develop as your business matures and grows.
All right. No, let's go back to the beginning, though, because you said something interesting about how entrepreneurs sometimes think that if they have an NDA signed or something that protects them. I'll set the record straight right now. One, we don't sign NDAs when we get pitched a startup idea because our job as an investor is obviously to validate the idea mixed with the market and the opportunity. So signing an NDA, and we see 10,000 companies a year. So would you not agree that an NDA really just doesn't hold more than the weight of its paper it's signed on?
Yeah, NDA is a helpful tool, but it's not. I wouldn't bet my company on an NDA. But that's for sure.
So what advice would you have for an early stage founder, an early stage tech company who is trying to get their idea funded while keeping a good strategy around their intellectual property importance when trying to get their company to the level where they can start to actually sell a good or service?
So I think there's 3 or 4 pieces they need to consider. Contract terms are important, whether that's an NDA, whether that's development contracts, whether it's employment contracts with staff. There do need to be proper intellectual property ownership terms within those contracts. That does give them something to fall back on if things go sideways. So I think that would be a key piece to start with. The second piece is their staff or a partner, right? Do you have appropriate arrangements and understanding with those individuals as you get moving in terms of how these things are going to be treated, the types of things to communicate to the outside world, what to keep confidential, and how to manage those conversations. In particular, as you start to get into either seeking investment or selling to customers, you're going to have to divulge a certain amount of information in order to attract interest. We talk to entrepreneurs that are really conflicted by that, where that line is. I want to keep everything confidential, but then they can't get enough traction with an investor or with a customer because of that. So there's a line there that's a bit fluid and needs to move, but they need to really learn by doing in terms of how far to go in terms of disclosing to set that hook and really generate stronger interest. Getting started with an IP strategy, and it doesn't need to be really full blown. We've got this really detailed 100-step plan and a pipeline of 50 patents, but an understanding of what are the technologies, what are the features that are going to make a difference for you over time, and what is your path to building in a position that includes a variety of rights. Get started with patenting, but understand how to treat and manage trade secrets. Are there trademarks or other branding pieces that are going to be important over time, and how do you start to manage those things? Get started, but don't get out over your skis and get too far into it. You can waste, I'll use that word, a lot of capital in getting too far into this process too aggressively. I think get started, but you need to test the market and understand where you're going to go. You're likely going to pivot and adapt as an early stage company. Building a portfolio of 20 to 40 patents really quickly likely is detrimental to you and not necessary. But get started in that process and understand what are the decision-making factors in order to proceed to pursue a particular source of protection as you move forward.
Overprotection could almost kill a company before they even get off the ground. I'm sure you've seen that many a times.
Absolutely. This is not an inexpensive endeavor. Getting out ahead of where the business is from access to capital from a revenue standpoint and ramping up your cost dramatically really puts the business in danger. So I would proceed gradually and with moderation, but have some triggers of when you need to start investing more heavily and starting to ramp that IP protection up more aggressively.
Right. And, as CEO of the Innovation Asset Collective, what are some of the key components of your educational programs that you're trying to help entrepreneurs understand and implement some of these effective IP strategies?
The core piece of our educational program is an IP maturity framework. So it's a systemized approach to evaluating the level of IP sophistication of an entrepreneur or a business. Where are they in this journey? And that allows us to do two things. It gives us the opportunity to direct specific resources to them that fit where they are. So we're not sending them to an advanced course on collaboration and joint venture agreements when they're really early stage and need sort of a one-on-one intro to basic strategy or basic IP rights. And on the flip side, if they're a much more experienced company, maybe an entrepreneur that's had several exits and has been through this process before, they don't need the one-on-one version of what we're doing. They need more advanced support, the ability to test specific situations with experts that have been through them before. So that maturity framework allows us to match delivery of resources to what the company actually needs. And then the second piece it allows us to do is track their progress over time. So that's the big piece here of there's a lot of educational resources out there that a company can access, but what do they actually need and what's going to move them forward as a business and really help them be more successful at the end of the day. So this allows us to track that progress and have some metrics around not just their activity, but the outcomes being delivered by that activity. We match that then with basically two different streams of educational resource. We have an online learning platform so that the entrepreneurs and business leaders can access that in their own time. We know they're busy. They need to build technology. They need to go sell that technology. So they need to be able to access that learning when they have a free half hour or free 45 minutes and know specifically what they need to go into. That online tool is being built out. We have, I think, over 40 different modules in there today and a roadmap to continue to build that and advance that material. But the second piece is those entrepreneurs need in-person assistance, right? An online course you can learn only so much from. You need to have access to people that have been there and done this before. So we have 10 IP experts as part of our core staff. We'll run workshops for companies to help them advance different pieces, but more importantly, they can pick up the phone and if they're facing a problem, facing a decision, get access to our staff and help work through those pieces and make more effective decisions because they have access to those type of people.
Mike, I think a lot of our listeners are probably hearing you talk about all the great benefits of building an IP strategy, but what we read in the headlines is that Canada has a bit of a headwind against it when it comes to creating commercial opportunities out of the IP that is created at some of our educational institutions. How do Canadian companies or how should Canadian companies think about encountering IP-related challenges when entering the global markets? And what sort of tools and strategies are you recommending they start to think about implementing as they start to think about going global with some of their commercialization efforts?
Great question. Yeah, but maybe first I'll address the situation in Canada. We really underperform when it comes to intellectual property, both the generation of quality rights and the using those rights and the underlying technologies to drive commercial outcomes. In the last 20 years, the ownership of Canadian invented patents has tripled from 18% to 56% in the last 20 plus years.
By foreign entities?
Yes.
That is insane.
That is insane. If that ownership of intellectual property is a core to delivering large returns to Canadian entrepreneurs, that shift really shows the state of future success and future prosperity in this country.
Walk us through some examples of what that is in real life. Are we talking about like the Huawei stuff? Like what are we talking about here in terms of the IP that's owned by foreign entities?
So I think there's several different pieces to that. Yes, there's the Huawei's or other foreign entities that are buying up Canadian-generated research, buying patents, buying research time, et cetera. That's a piece of it. But also, if you look at the large corporations that were filing large number of patents, the Nortels, the BlackBerries, some of those companies don't exist anymore and or have been sold off for parts.
So the foreign buyers of the assets in Canada now own those IPs. So you're talking about all like the Copperleafs or whatever it is, that own, cybersecurity IP. They've been acquired by global or U.S. private equity firms. They own the IP now.
Exactly. And if you look at what has filled the gap in terms of employment of Canadian innovators, Canadian engineers, Canadian scientists, it is primarily large foreign multinationals. Yes, we're still inventing here, right? Doing great research work, great development work, but the ownership of the resulting IP goes to the companies those innovators are working for, and that's typically a foreign-based company, so the profits are going to flow outside of the country.
Now, some might say that's a good thing, right? We're creating great technology that we can then sell for a higher value to some other global partners, and then they can continue to take it to scale. But would you also argue that we're creating only maybe a fraction of the value before we sell it off, and the majority of the value is recouped by some of these?
It's a great thing for employment. It's a great thing for advancing technology and having Canadians working in the field. But it's very similar, I'd say, to a resource-based approach, right? For an example that's really familiar here in Canada, of where is the true value being generated and being realized, and that's happening outside of the country. The financial outcome or the maximum piece of the financial outcome is not happening here. And that's a problem for our long-term prospect.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that we're saying we need to have 100% of the prosperity created locally. That's okay to have 50% or more. But what we're saying is 50% or more than 50% of the intellectual property assets are owned by foreign entities, and they're extracting a majority, if not all, the value from a lot of these technology innovations, correct?
Correct.
So what is your recommendation for building a process for building a defensive patent portfolio to help startups protect themselves against some of these larger companies, and maybe delve into some thoughts around IP insurance benefits and things like that?
So I think it's multifaceted. We need to change the behaviors of Canadian companies so that they are more sophisticated, more advanced in their practices, and more active. Right? They're taking these steps on a regular basis. So that first starts with educating the Canadian entrepreneurs, the Canadian innovators on these issues so that they understand how to do it. Historically, that would be done. They would learn from a large company, right? The Nortels, the BlackBerries were great training grounds for understanding these issues. That doesn't exist here anymore. So steps are being taken to build those education pieces. IEC is one of them, but there's a number of others across the Canadian ecosystem at both the federal and provincial level, which has been great to see over the last few years. We need to build that understanding. Then you need to give those companies tools and infrastructure they can use until they have the IP positions of their own to be self-sufficient. So at IEC, we have two key pieces to that. We're building a defensive patent portfolio that our member companies can access. So we're out buying patents on the open market that can help protect Canadian clean tech companies. We've identified 125 multinationals that play in the clean tech space and have a track record of litigating patents against SMEs to protect their market share. So we've identified where those companies make their money, what are their revenue streams, and we're out buying patents that can provide leverage against those revenue streams so that if any of our member companies face an issue before they have their own patent portfolios developed sufficiently to respond, we can transfer assets to them so that they are armed and prepared to respond.
So you're acting as almost an iron dome, if you will, of protection against your constituents before they're ready to have their own protection defense mechanisms, because you've gone out ahead of time and purchased some of these patents. Have any of those come to actually work in the process of defending them?
Not yet. We're only really 2.5 years into that buying process. We've started to see a few of our members run into some issues. Because the portfolio is in early stages, it hasn't been an exact fit for those companies at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. But it's a co-op of sorts. Everyone helps each other, even though they're not directly benefiting one-on-one right now.
Yeah, there's that's the collective nature of our piece is sharing of knowledge, share of an understanding, sharing of that participation as we build this portfolio out to benefit.
And you mentioned that the government is obviously helping influence the development and execution of these IP strategies. Can you give us some examples of how the government is supporting and funding some of these Canadian organizations like yours?
Absolutely. The federal government launched their IP strategy in 2018. Coming out of that initial strategy was the first set of funding for IAC, our organization. So they provided $30 million for an initial pilot project to test this concept. That pilot project came to an end this past March, and the latest federal budget provided an additional $14.5 million for our organization to continue its efforts. As part of the federal IP strategy, they also launched the Elevate IP program, which is funding IP education and providing direct money to companies to pursue intellectual property rights through collection of incubators and accelerators across the country. So there's 5 regional hubs for that, one in BC, one in Alberta, one in central Canada, one in Quebec, and one in the Atlantic provinces. That's been a major program. There's also IRAP has an IP program, IP Assist, that provides a significant amount of funding to Canadian companies looking to build out IP assets, as does the Trade Commissioner's Office. So Trade Commissioner's Office will provide money for companies looking to export or build into global markets as well. So there's 4 different federal programs providing either funding, training, or different tool sets for companies. And then some of the provinces have also started to get engaged. Ontario is the farthest along. They have a program called IP Ontario, or an agency set up, in fact, called IP Ontario. That's we're working really closely with to do a lot of the same things. Innovate BC is starting down this path and looking at some pieces. Alberta has just started an IP certification program to help train their entrepreneurs. So a number of things going on at the provincial levels as well. So
that's fantastic. We've been seeing a lot of mostly US-based IP marketplace / automation platforms to help simplify the process for filing and managing your intellectual property assets. I think a lot of the times startups, especially as I mentioned, think that the process to get IP protected is very costly and convoluted and time sucking from all the limited resources they have. We've gone through our own trademark and patent protection for our own brands at Ripple. And I thought that was something we probably shouldn't have done early on, but I'm very happy we did do it later on. And now we own our own trademark and copyright. But I think some mistakes would be great for you to share that you've seen startups make regarding IP strategy and how you think they can easily avoid them initially with some of the support you mentioned from the organizations that are working to do this.
Yeah, I think there's some common ones. And the one somewhat referred to is not taking any action at all because you view this as too complicated or too expensive. And unfortunately, there are some service providers out there that their sales pitches, this is complicated, leave this to us and we'll figure it out for you. And I think that really does the entrepreneurs a disservice because they don't even get to grasp the basics of these concepts. And they're somewhat fearful as a result of those sales pitches. Putting that aside, understanding there are some really simple things you can learn relatively quickly, and then you're going to build that knowledge over time as you move forward by getting active and starting to pursue these things. That's a key first piece of don't avoid this because you think it's too complicated. The second common error is the reliance on a single piece of protection. I mentioned before that filing of the first provisional patent. Oftentimes, companies have taken that step and they think that's sufficient, and they don't start to build out a roadmap of what else is going to be needed. What are the triggers to pursue those additional forms of protection? As I said, I wouldn't rush to 40 patents by any stretch of the imagination, but have that roadmap and have those decision-making points or milestones thought through a bit, so that as the business moves forward, you can start to add to that protection and build out at a methodical or regular pace that's consistent with where the business is going, a suite of IP assets.
Yeah, people don't really understand when you say provisional patent, that's just a 1-year protection, basically, to get your stuff in order to get to the next stage. Maybe you can give our listeners a bit of a deeper understanding of what the initial stages look like and when it starts to become realistic versus rather than just conversation fodder.
Great point. Yeah, I throw around some industry terms and assume people know them. So provisional patent is basically a way of establishing your place in line. Doesn't require you to file patent claims, which are really the definition of what your protection is going to have. But you outline sort of the key aspects of the technology, and it establishes a date as to where that invention has been filed, and gives you a year to follow up with a full application to understand how that technology may evolve in that year. You may add some additional material, but really firm up what are the claims that you want to really capture and protect, and buys you some time to gather more information, but also limits that expense in that first year as well. It's a really good.
Yeah, when someone comes to us and says we filed a provisional patent, that's exactly what we tell them. You've set your date and you've now put yourself in line. But other than that, it creates no protection.
Exactly. It's not until that full application has been examined by the patent office in the country you're applying to, and they have issued the final patent that you have that protection. So yeah, a number of steps that need to happen in sequence post that provisional patent being filed.
So I guess in terms of your experience in value creation throughout this IP process, what are you seeing that is the biggest driver of creating value around IP strategy at the early stages before you start bumping up against the incumbents? Because sometimes we say kind of pre-Series A, it doesn't really make sense unless you're building obviously a deep tech or a hardware device that needs to have that. And in software, everything is changing all the time. It's really hard to get patents around your software code. So where do you see the right time? And I know it's very bespoke around different strategies of businesses for companies to think about going past the initial filing of the protection and getting into a little bit more of the value creation pathway.
So a few different layers to that. I think before I start talking about kind of building a position, I think there's a flip in mindset that needs to happen with those entrepreneurs. Stop thinking about the filing of a patent, for example, as a protection for a past event, right? We've created this invention. We need to file a patent to protect that past event. You need to be thinking about how do you create optionality for your business, right? And what are the revenue drivers that are going to happen in the future and the potential applications for this technology. And that's really where the thinking about the building of intellectual property needs to occur. It's around those future revenue streams, not around this past event of invention. There's got to be a link between the two, and the IP serves as the bridge from invention of technology to future revenue stream. How do we create a bridge and protect the options that get us from A to B? So that's kind of a change of mindset that we really want to encourage and kind of flick that switch in Canadian businesses. And then you need to look at how do you start to build out a collection of assets over time so that you are ready to play when you start to get your first sales or when you start to try and enter international markets and you're maybe going to disrupt a large incumbent. So how are you prepared to deal with those situations? And that takes some analysis of of the space you're in. As you mentioned, if you're working in the semiconductor space or the wireless space, those are densely patented with aggressive patent assertion and licensing organizations, whether they're operating companies or MPEs. You're going to need to take a very different approach than if you're in, say, an online web service business with maybe less patenting activity and less licensing or assertion of assets within those businesses. So understand the space you're in and the pace you're going to have to go at to build a position based on sort of those benchmarks of what are the table stakes in this given market or space, and then build yourself a roadmap as you would with your technology roadmap, right? Your product roadmap. How are you going to evolve and add features with time, and what are your key milestones for that? Similarly, with building out an IP position, you shouldn't be doing this all at once. It needs to be staged. What are those stages? What are the decision-making pieces? Right? Okay, we're moving from just selling in Canada to selling in the US, Germany, and Japan. We've got to ramp up our activity because there's going to be players in those countries with more substantial IP positions. We need to do some other things. We need to learn about contracting terms in some of those countries. So there's certain key milestones that as the business matures and evolve, they need to add in capabilities, add in knowledge sets so that they create the opportunity to be successful as they cross those lines.
Yeah, Mike, what kind of experts do you recommend people do this planning with? Obviously, a corporate, legal counsel is probably not the best person to be doing this. Is it an IP lawyer specific, as a collective like yours, an agency, EDC? I don't know. Who should people be talking to about this planning?
I think you're going to need probably a collection of advisors. There's no one person that's going to have all of the answers. We can provide a good amount of advice on the strategy piece of really, here's how to think about strategy, here's how to get started and work them through steps. And then we provide a fair amount of coaching of how to find the right experts for different problems they're facing, what types of questions to ask to bring those people on. And I think it's a blend. There's some IP legal expertise they're going to need. They're not going to have that in-house. They're going to need access to people that have sold into different geographies, into different markets that can help guide those pieces. I know, an example, in my past career, we acquired a company in China and started to use that as a base to sell into China and faced a list of challenges as a result. We had a senior employee selling some of our work as his own through a side business. We had another employee working for a completely unrelated business while claiming a salary from ours. So there was a set of relationships we needed to build in that geography that would give us early warning flags when those things were happening. So in addition to the legal rights, the legal contracts, in many cases, it's a building of a network of people that can help you understand when things are going off the rails and you need to step in and deal with certain situations. So I think that's a final piece of advice for entrepreneurs is not just rely on the legal mechanisms. You need to have people that can help raise awareness and identify problems so that you can deal with them more assertively.
What we're seeing too, Mike, is a lot of employees leaving sort of later stage tech companies or public tech companies where they've been working for years, and they're taking the knowledge they have from working at those businesses and creating solutions that they probably learned a lot of the problem set space from those prior employers. So thinking about that as sort of the backdrop, what do you think founders of startups should be thinking about in their employee contracts regarding intellectual property and product creation while employees are working underneath them? Because you mentioned it at the beginning, and I want to understand how people should be thinking about that now, especially in the innovation space.
Yeah, there's always going to be a certain amount of transfer, right? People are allowed to leave with the general knowledge they've developed. But if things are really specific to the founder's technology, the founder's product, the founder's customers, you need to have language in your employment agreements that clearly states the rights you have as a business with respect to those things and your expectations of how they're going to be treated by your employees when they leave.
And are those enforceable in Canada? We just saw, obviously, the non-compete clause get removed in the US market. Are those things enforceable in Canada?
So non-compete needs to be very narrowly bounded to be enforceable, but I think there are things around the use of the intellectual property that are more enforceable. So I think that's a stronger lever to rely on of, hey, this is our IP, whether it be patents, but more frequently trade secrets, whether that be technology lists or technology details of how to implement a particular recipe or process, or if it's sets of customers and their specific problems and solutions that you're being offered, price books, things like that. If you're able to clearly identify those things and do that thoroughly and well, show that there's business value tied to those things and that you've taken steps to protect and secure them. And if you can do those three things, then you put yourself in a really good position to have leverage if somebody tries to do something inappropriate.
That's some good advice. Okay. And I want to specifically focus on IP insurance. It's something you hear about, but something people are not so familiar with when opting in for such coverage. Can you explain how IP insurance functions as a tool to sort of de-risk scaling operations and how should startups think about it before opting into it?
Absolutely. So this is something that wasn't part of the initial plan with IC. It was as we explored our member companies and listened to their needs, we heard that the patent portfolio building was going to be helpful, but not sufficient to deal with these issues. Or in the case of a couple more mature companies that had their own patent portfolios, they were worried about, in many cases, conversations with larger customers who had the potential to steal or copy their technology and replace them as a vendor. And while they had IP, they didn't have money to pay for a dispute if they got into a need to assert their patents or protect themselves against outside patents. So our solution to that was to work with an insurance broker to put in place a baseline policy for our members. And companies can do this on their own as well. Through our collective, we've been able to achieve a discounted price point for the coverage we offer. But you can get insurance policies that protect you against third-party assertion. So if a competitor were to assert patents against you as a company, if a patent troll or MP were to assert patents against you as a company, these defensive protections would kick in and provide you with money to pay your lawyers, fight that dispute, as well as potentially pay any damages that could result from a negative outcome.
That's interesting. Okay. And tell us how does it work in the sort of fundraising efforts? You know, you talked about leveraging IP as well to attract investors. Does this IP insurance also help in attracting investors on a fundraising side or potentially maximizing value for an exit?
So I think it works in two different pieces. It shows that the business has thought through risk and identified some tools to help manage that risk so that the downside has been protected. And as an investor, I think that's one, attractive to how the downside managed. Two, that you've got a mature set of business leaders here that have thought this through and found a solution. I think both of those things are check marks for potential investors. The second piece, and this is something I learned from one of our members, it allowed them to be more successful commercially because they were going out to some large potential customers and being asked to sign up to IP indemnity clauses that could be quite punitive if something went wrong. And they were bringing on this insurance policy to help protect against that indemnity clause. But by having a price for the insurance, it allowed them to price that indemnity into their contract. So they knew what they had to pay for the insurance. They could then add that into their product price. So that pricing clarity was greatly aided by going through this process.
Wow, that's very interesting. And then do you have any anecdotal stories around maximizing value on an exit or liquidity event from a company that you worked with around their IP portfolio strategy?
So the largest example is the one I mentioned with the company I actually work with, Tech Insights. It faced an unfortunate situation where our CEO and primary owner passed away in a very unfortunate scuba diving accident in 2008. And that led to sale of the business and started a round of private equity investment. But the core value of that business was creating value-added information gathering that couldn't be easily replicated by others, and then creating an inventory or a database of that result that grew in value over time, so that every year additional products were analyzed that just created more and more value because it wasn't just a point sale of a report. There was a database or a collection of inventory that grew over time, and people are interested in different segments of that and different cuts of that. And by creating appropriate business models, that ramp the valuation of that company over 100x. So really big when they're entirely driven by different forms of intellectual property, and the value that the investors put on the ability to monetize that intellectual property.
Wow. I got to ask you, because it's not often we get IP experts like you in the tank, but people are obviously questioning a lot of things around ownership rights and copyrights and patentability and liability around artificial intelligence and the training of models and the creation of content as it relates to IP laws. So how do you think people should be thinking about the way that AI is infringing on someone's IP? And how do you think the way in which the data is being used to generate AI assets is going to play out in the IP legal framework?
That's a complicated one, and there's a number of different pieces of it. So there is IP around the AI algorithms, the AI engines themselves, as well as the hardware needed for them to run on, and how those two pieces work together. So I think there's a complicated set of decision making there on what to trade secret, what to patent within that particular domain. The angst over is this patentable or not is false. And really the question people should be asking themselves is, if I choose not to because I either am ethically against ownership rights in this type of technology, or I think it's not patentable, the patenting rates from foreign companies in this space have ramped. It's hit the inflection point, is going up skyward. If you as a company are not going to protect your intellectual property, other people are, and you're going to be boxed out really quickly. So that would be my first point. The second point around the training, the data sets used to train those algorithms and the access to copyrighted material to do so, that's a bit outside of my area of expertise. In my mind, there's some lines there that definitely have been crossed, and people just kind of going out and scraping these large databases of publications.
Asking for forgiveness later on after they've already used it.
It's a crude example, but I'm a hip hop fan. I think of sampling in the rap world that was done with great freedom for a decade or two, and then the piper had to be paid at a certain point. That's probably an analogy, a crude one, but an analogy that will play here. Of there's going to be mechanisms built to allow the owners of the copyrights and the intellectual property be compensated for its use, and there are likely going to be some large dollar awards that kind of trigger a more rational thinking around how to price those things and what sort of marketplaces should be developed to allow those things to happen more efficiently. And then there's a final piece, which you didn't mention, but a lot of debate in the patent world right now about can AI be an inventor of a patent? And the various patent offices are working through the pros and cons of that right now. There's going to need to be some likely initial regulatory decisions on that, but potentially legislative decisions around is that a good thing or a bad thing down the road.
Yeah, I think the IP law framework is obviously going to need to change and evolve, but we've seen this work in the past. I mean, the most notable lawsuit I always think about is Ice Ice Baby, where under pressure, was obviously at the center of a lawsuit between Vanilla Ice, Robert Van Winkle in the 90s, and Nice Ice Baby, which obviously was a huge success. And Queen and David Bowie, who are the creators of Under Pressure, they threatened to sue for copyright infringement, and that was settled out of court. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of that exact examples play out in the content space around use of content. But I think the market is figuring it out faster than the courts are, where they're trying to create these data sharing agreements and settlements, if you will, pre-taking it to court, because we know how long and shitty that process is. So I appreciate you kind of riffing on that.
Always better to do it that way.
Always better to do it that way. Well, Mike, before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
That is one I don't have. Don't listen to a lot of podcasts.
No audiobooks or anything like that either?
I'm a reader. Reader's my way to go.
A reader. Okay, we'll get to that soon. How about any newsletter or blogs that you subscribe to?
James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, get his weekly newsletter 321. I've found that really helpful in establishing clear thinking and building some better practices, both professionally and personally in my life. That
sounds pretty cool. Next is your favorite tech gadget?
Addicted to my phone, unfortunately. That's probably my go-to.
And are you an Android or an Apple user?
I'm an Android.
Nice. That makes sense. And next is your favorite new trend?
Don't know if I have a favorite. That's out there.
You've been end-to-end. Have you been into anything lately that you are trying to pick up or more? Is it cycling? Is it hiking? Anything like that?
I coach a lot of youth baseball. 2 of my 3 children are very active with baseball, so working to understand, particularly with my younger guy, some of his hitting techniques. So doing some learning on that side right now.
Spending a lot of time on YouTube coaching?
Very much so, yeah.
Nice. And this one I think you'll have a good answer for. Your favorite book?
My favorite book, from a professional standpoint, Turn the Ships Around. It's by an ex-U.S. Navy commander who took over an underperforming U.S. submarine and talks about how he built the team to turn that around and what is really needed in terms of individual responsibility, individual learning, and development of people and team to achieve that type of change. But also, he really emphasizes that change had to last after he moved on to another command. So that couldn't all be about him and need to be about the broader group. So I took a lot away from that book.
Very interesting. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson?
Take ownership of your mistakes. Everybody makes them. We all have failures. And where that really sunk in for me, we had one of our largest clients that was significantly unhappy and talking about potentially pulling their business. And I flew to meet with them and spent 2 days with them, talking through their problems, figuring out solutions, what changes we need to implement, how they can make some changes to help us be more successful as well. And about 18 months after that meeting, one of their executives gave me a call and just said, "Mike, this is going really well. And I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to recover this. But you came into that meeting and really owned your mistakes and were honest about why those mistakes had happened, not in making excuses, but in an attempt to find solutions with us as to what can go forward." And that conversation has stayed with me for a long time.
I love that. Owning your mistakes, owning up to it, and trying to find a pathway forward is great advice. Thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with Mike McLean, CEO at Innovation Asset Collective.
Thanks for having me. A great time.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.